All right. Oh, wow. We have thank you for everybody in the audience who's here. We'll just, we'll get started in just a few minutes here. Thank you all for being here. We have over 60 folks. That's awesome.
70 now.
Dang, cool. You guys are, this is the most popular one.
And that's not even counting
food was being
Facebook.
served.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Jared. Good to see you. Been a while.
Good to see you. It has.
All right, it says we're successfully streaming to Facebook. So I will be behind the scenes in case anybody needs anything. Feel free to message me. I'll see you guys for the discussion portion.
All right, we getting started? All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to the 4th session of the Food Sovereignty Speaker Series. We're very excited to host today's panel, and let's get started. Yug Holly Du, Cody Henriksen Ilan Shida, Lydia Enseleski Shunkda Nilan, Fedora Kwasnikov Shunkda Nilan, Denina Sukbiak Ilan Shida, Shukaya Hidi Nikanchik Kilan. Hello everyone, my name is Cody Henriksen. I'm an enrolled member of the Ninilchik village tribe and of Denina and Sugpiaq descent. I'm also Russian, Norwegian, and Danish. I was born and raised in my tribe's traditional territory in Alaska, and currently I live here in Arcata where I'm an undergraduate at HSU studying marine biology and Native American studies. I am also proudly a member of the HSU Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace. And I'll pass it off now to my friend and partner here, Evie. You're still muted.
Thanks, Cody. Hi, my name is Evie Ferreira. I'm from Tucson, Arizona, and my grandparents are from Naco y Moris, Hermosillo, and in Sonora, Mexico. I'm a recent graduate from Humboldt State University, and I'm also a proud member of the HSU Food Sovereignty and Cultural Workspace, and hopefully pretty soon Research Center. I majored in Native American Studies and Environmental Studies with a minor in Ethnic Literature, and we want to thank you all so much for joining us today. This 4th speaker series, hosted by the Humboldt State University Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace, with your enthusiasm and support, is going to be the first of many speaker series. Next Monday, November 30th, will be our last speakers event from 1 to 2:30 p.m., focusing on Indigenous food sovereignty and timing of climate change with Dr. Kyle White.
And before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that Humboldt State University's occupation of unceded Wiyot territory. This territory includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. HSU is located in Arcata, known as Gudini, meaning over in the woods or among the redwoods. Wiyot peoples continue to remain in relationship to these lands through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. They are important parts of not only the history of this area, but also in the continuing knowledge of this place. And as numerous Indigenous scholars have articulated, land acknowledgements are a beginning, not an end. For land acknowledgements to be meaningful, they need to be accompanied with action. And today, our call of action is for all of you to donate to the HSU's Food Sovereignty and Cultural Lab Workspace. And we'll be happy to throw a link in the chat there for you.
The title of our panel discussion today is Fire and Food Sovereignty. For thousands of years, tribes across California and the world have used intentional burns to renew local food, basketry materials, medicinal and cultural resources, create habitat for the more than human world, and reduce the risk of larger and intense wildfires. This panel discussion will provide insights on the relationship between fire and food sovereignty. The panel will review federal policies that pertain to tribal sovereignty and access to ancestral lands and resources. The panelists will also discuss the importance of traditional ecological knowledge and tribal leadership in advancing prescribed cultural burning, and further suggest ways for non-native scientists, land managers, and members of the public to help build coalitions, reestablish landscape-scale cultural fire management, and sustain Indigenous food sovereignty. We will be hearing from a panel of speakers, including Dr. Frank Lake, Merv George, Dr. Jared Aldrin, and Ronnie Reed. We're happy to have all of you speaking today. Cody and I would like to briefly present our speakers before letting them introduce themselves during their presentations. Our first presenter today will be Dr. Frank Lake, a wildland fire and fields research scientist. Frank Lake grew up in northwestern California, surrounded by the Pacific Coast, Humboldt Bay, redwoods, and Klamath River. His experience growing up among his Yurok and Kuduk family allowed him to develop a deep appreciation for the traditional ecological knowledge of his elders. Today, he brings the perspective of recognizing the value of diverse points of view to his work at the Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station. Merv George Jr. Will be our second presenter. Merv George Jr. has been the forest supervisor on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest since May 2018. Prior to joining the U.S. Forest Service, Merv served 15 years in various tribal government positions, including service on the Hoopa Valley Tribal Council and service as tribal chairman from 1995 to 1999. Merv obtained his BA in Native American Studies from Humboldt State University in 1997 and is a graduate of the Indian Teacher Education and Personal Program at HSU. I'll pass the mic to Cody.
Thank you. We will then hear from Dr. Jared Aldrin. Jared Aldrin is an environmental historian and fire practitioner. Retired from educational and tribal government staff careers, he is a lead investigator and research associate with the West on Fire Research and Education Initiative of Huntington USC Institute on California and the West, and co-founder of the Sierra Sequoia Burn Cooperative. Ronnie Reed Jr. will be joining us today also, and is a proud Native American from Karuk, Hoopa, and Yurok tribes. He is a member of Hoopa Valley Tribe. Ronnie has worked for the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, a nonprofit organization located in Orleans, California, the U.S. Forest Service, and became a wildland firefighter on the Wildland Fire Use Module in Orleans. In 2018, he continued his career in Forest Service and got offered a permanent position in Willow Creek, California as an apprentice, which is where he works to this day. His goal as an employee of the Forest Service are to continue large efforts in prescribed burning and to be a positive influence to his nieces, nephews, and his future children, and then up and coming generations too. In his off time, he enjoys his friends, family, partner, and being outdoors. He also enjoys spending his time backpacking, dipping at fishing, and being with his dad and brothers, hunting, camping, cutting firewood, and relaxing on the beaches of the North Coast. If you have any questions for our speakers today, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will be live on Facebook, where you can also submit your questions in the comments. Please enjoy the fourth session of the Food Sovereignty Speaker Series, and we were happy to have you with us today. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Frank Lake. Please tell us more about yourself.
All right, yeah, thank you for this opportunity to present. And I want to be able to share my screen so I can get going with the presentation there. So hopefully we can navigate that. Is there a way to do that? I'm not seeing it. There we go, getting there. Face me. Good. Share. Give me a moment here. Beginning. All right, you all should be able to see my main screen. So thank you again for this opportunity. I just want to say right off the bat, I'm really proud of Ronnie. I've known him for years, from a teenager to where he's at now. And it's one of those moments where you see a younger Native man that you're proud of. They work hard, they apply themselves. And I really want to just give a shout out to him because he makes me happy and proud every time I see him. Glad he's here today.
I appreciate that, Frank. Good to see you.
Yeah. Yotwa. Traditional ecological knowledge, a lot of us are familiar with this academic working definition, but really for me, it's in the context of learning, like from here from my Karuk grandfather, Charlie Tom, out gathering huckleberries at acorns, or my community forestry mentor, Laverne. Ferris glaze, and that was a lot of the time during my graduate work, but also just through the family, growing up amongst my Yurok and Karuk family, and really learning with respects to, say, food sovereignty. Much of the Yurok side of the family talked about the only rights are the ones you have assert, and going out there and securing the food and maintaining that traditional responsibilities. And so it really is intergenerational. And I think when we think about where we learned the way of collecting and harvesting food and exercise that sovereign part of it, it's about that knowledge genealogy of who taught you and respecting that. And in that regard, I'm a knowledge steward for those families and others that have invested in me, and I hope to do them right and do them proud. Related to this is traditional fire knowledge. And Dr. Mary Huffman, who I work with at the Nature Conservancy's Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, has a great fire synthesis here, but traditional fire-related knowledge, beliefs, and practices developed over a long time in a place related to fire, and I'll go through some of those. Indigenous knowledge guides fire stewardship within our fire-prone ecosystem, like much of the area we live here in the West, for fire-dependent species, which are used as highly valued resources. At the core of this teaching is that fire is medicine, and that links to the fire regimes, which are often cultural fire regimes. And it's the evolution of these cultural fire regimes that emerge from indigenous cultural adaptations to form fire-dependent cultures. And at the core of that is that cultural burning is a form of human services for ecosystems that often help reduce the extreme ranges of variability and increase resource condition quality and predictability of those resources. And that really varies through space and time. When working with Indigenous knowledge, particularly around Indigenous fire stewardship and cultural burning, it's important to recognize that gender, age, and cultural responsibilities also reflect the body of knowledge that mentor or elder or practitioner has. And it's recognizing that different members of that community hold different types of knowledge. Also understanding what the responsibility and roles are for that. And that could be from spiritual or ceremonial leaders, everything from medicine fires and sweat lodges to even teachings and philosophies around fire use related to subsistence activities, particularly to procure food and basket material that holds that food. For other utilitarian or domestic, even like we'd say today, such as the wildland urban interface and using fire around your homes for preventing wildfire, and then also for economic and security, whether some of us, like Ronnie and others and myself, worked on wildfires today or MERV as form of a contemporary economic form of security. We're still out there working fire in our traditional territories or across the landscape is important to us and a part of our service. Working with diverse communities really ranges from villages and tribes, and even within those groups or families have a diverse perspective of fire and fire effects. And in working with those leaders really helps support inclusivity of a fuller range of those types of knowledge systems related to fire, cultural burning, and fire effects. For me as a federal research scientist, really it's incorporating Indigenous knowledge and that to incorporate into research management and to affect policy. So you start with the researchable questions or the science support needs of the community. What metrics are meaningful or important, not only say to an ecologist or fire scientist, but also their practitioners in the tribal community. What methods do you conduct to collect that research and those information? How it goes about an analysis and your findings, and then even down to interpreting that interpretations of those findings and your discussions, and then have that best available science to guide management and policy. And then for that, directly relating to the inclusivity and the respectful use of tribal knowledge and working with tribal partners, that can come to be benefits to tribes and societies greatly. So really the application of Indigenous and Western science that improves management to achieve objectives for sociocultural values, and that creating that best available science. So really for me, it's a lot of it's field-based studies, but building upon that Indigenous science support, linking multiple lines of evidence using various methods, have treatment-based outcomes of TEK. Various studies that I'll talk about really are at the core of that for some of the proud work I'm doing with my partners, prior grad students. Fine-tune those seasonality prescriptions of treatments that are based on Indigenous knowledge that might be different in even what Western science may be aware of. Identify trigger points, thresholds, and indicators. Often sometimes the scale that we're studying at may miss relevant indicators of cultural importance that can be wildlife and other culturally relevant aspects across the landscape. And then have that guide monitoring and adaptive management for those habitats or those field types, those species that are used as resources, and are really also using cultural use quality as a a way to evaluate the treatment effectiveness. So often for what scale to study things, in my teachings from elders, they often talk about the canopy cover or closure and light dynamics, also how that affects understory, such as the light that receives to the forest floor for the plants, such as flowering and nut production and berry production, but also the fire effects. I use a variety of forestry plots, and within those forestry plots, you can have individual sampling, such as this huckleberry shrub, and teaching that at that scale. And now using aerial LiDAR and other forms of technology and remote sensing to also evaluate that I call it the techie tech, the terrestrial ecological knowledge of technology to evaluate condition of the habitat and resource quality, as well as the best places to effectively manage and have that benefit of that collaboration. The framing of this is often done through resources, which are elements of the environment, a scaled approach from landscapes to sites, objects, and even the state of mind, often how good you feel when you're gathering or when you're out there, the condition of that place, and the natural and cultural resources that are used to perpetuate those cultural customs, practices, and knowledge systems. And then you have a habitat, which are landscapes or places that support tribal ceremonies, subsistence practices that can be biophysically defined, such as using vegetation classifications, or those culturally defined, such as a family gathering site. But within that, and if you see my photo here, we can have fire that comes off the prairie, scorches some of the trees, affects some of the soil, that affects the matsutake mushrooms and the mycorrhiza relationship that exchanges soil, water, and nutrients, and carbon with the huckleberry bushes that then has another mycorrhiza relationship with the oaks, and then fire affects all of that habitat, and it can have multiple resources of value there that are going to be affected, but also harvested and utilized at different times of the year or through the span of years, time since fire by severity within that habitat. And this has been framed by a lot of collaborative research with people I've been doing. So there's various methods that I've used from ethnobotany, historical ecology, forestry plots, and remote sensing. So there's this interdisciplinary part. I won't get into all of those. But an oak example here is in partnerships, even framing oak woodlands that were formerly tribally managed that now are looking for restoration sites as oak orchards. You help identify those current and former orchards as productive growth for more intense tending as active restoration. And then we need to consider how to evaluate whether tribal resources are available in a desired quantity and quality. And part of that is to identify and understand the common metrics and indicators. And so often a forester or fire scientist might be looking at fuel loading and tree density and cover. But in the case of black oak in the former slide, or this one here, or tan oaks, we can see that the metric might be important here. It might be the quality of the density of acorns and the proportion of good to bad acorns across the site. So we have here the Klamath River Treks under my acorn trees, my orchard, up in Orleans area, traditional burning in a modern context to achieve multiple objectives, such as reducing hazardous fuels in the wildland-urban interface along the egress route between me and my neighbors along my access road, promoting traditional food gathering here, as seen by my cousin Christopher, coming up to get good quality acorns to support ceremonies and the families down on the coast. And then also for me, doing a research burn in that prior treatment. So really it's an integration of different opportunities to collaboratively burn. And I have pictures here of Herman Albers, the Karuk igniter, with Rick O'Rourke, the Yurok igniter here burning on my land back on that Klamath River Treks. When it comes to other aspects of that, it's also utilizing the same bush, such as the California hazelnut. And when you incorporate indigenous knowledge into this, you can produce basketry sticks, as shown, the shoots or the resprouts coming off the tips at one time a year. And then also by tip pruning, you can foster the side branches to increase the nut production, and you have a full cycle there. So when you think about the adaptiveness of managing, say, California black oak and hazel bushes, more of the closed forest produces elongated shoots. For basket sticks, more of the open ecotones and more of the open prairies with pruning can produce some basket sticks, but more of the nuts. And then repeat the cycle again, and you have basketry and food resources like the nuts. Another aspect of this is looking at huckleberry production. In this regard, it just wasn't the density or the cover of the huckleberry bushes, but it was more importantly how they were fruiting and producing. So Colleen Rozier worked with us, the Karuk tribe and the Yuroks, on this project, and she came up with this huckleberry patch quality, and they're relating that to good margin or poor, and linked this huckleberry shrub measurements to the research plots where we also had LiDAR evaluation and cultural practitioner through the food grove assessments with the Karuk tribe and the Yurok crew. And so the huckleberry HPQ5 here is shown in the middle, is what we're going for. Loaded, purple teeth, and raw rich huckleberries. Another way of framing this, more so, is my work at the national level and regionally, and work at the National Agroforestry Center on what agroforestry is, in particular the tribal agroforestry. And that is defined as culturally informed, terrestrial knowledge-based practices that integrate management of trees, plants, fungi, and animals to the needs of indigenous community, and also benefiting tribes and the broader society. And through that, the core of this framework is indigenous fire stewardship that looks at silval pasture or animals management, both native and domesticated animals, agroforest products like managing acorns and huckleberries and the complex of that, and then forest farming, which looks at all levels from the soil to the canopy for food production, and how fire is the most effective tool in doing that. In linking this to broader policies and landscape strategies, we have to think about heterogeneity and resilience considerations, being able to manage on strategically placed landscape areas around the community and the most valuable areas of the landscape, linking it with climate change assessments and adaptation planning. And at the core of this, very much affects me and Merv's level of work, is acknowledging the national cohesive strategy for wildland fire, and that's resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities being prepared for wildfire, but also as fire dependent cultures for indigenous communities, and then wildland fire management responses on how we decide if and when an ignition starts, how we manage that fire to achieve resource values or to protect life, property, and values from adverse fire effects. And then linking that across the landscape from our towns to the mountains and to the rivers and to the coast to the higher out mountains for linking community values to that fire management. An example here of that is looking at the historical mapping that I've done for the Karuk villages and the Green and Yurok villages down by Witchpeck in the lower left corner, linking that to traversable ridges or trail networks that go across the landscape, taking that same landscape of interest between Orleans and Somes Bar as a study case area. And the red denotes the high priority or values overlay through the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. That have been identified as the highest priority areas to start the work. The yellow are the second tier priorities, and then the green is more of the other areas that have lesser value overlay, but also still important components to be able to manage and utilize fire in, and also for food production as well. There's a broader scale application of that within the Karuk tribe's ancestral territory across 2 national forests, in which Merv was the former forest supervisor, and then just to the north of that, going into still over in his country on the rogue, and aligning the management plans across jurisdictions for how we manage fire and restore landscape restoration processes. So when we link this together, it's kind of a recap: the wildland urban interface for valued habitats and resources, protect life, property, and resources from undesired wildfires, and increase sociocultural well-being and local economic factors. Have a focus on food security and sovereignty as that integrated work, and that food is good medicine. And then also think about the types of fuels reduction practices or treatments that we can have that help to get us there. And in that case, often the indigenous knowledge applied here is promoting drought tolerant and fire adapted species as part of those valued resources. In some cases where we want to be able to do treatments and also manage fire. Call your attention to the Karuk tribe's climate plan here. And we can see that we have a scaled across scales going from the lower elevation up to higher elevation through different vegetation types. Each of those having different vegetation and species of interest, having different cultural fire applications or how we manage wildfire there. And in the case even linking it to fisheries, this work that I've been doing where it looks at the effect of smoke that cools the rivers by the reflection of sunlight, cooling air temperature, cooling river temperature, that can even benefit fish. So there's a link there to water and the fisheries as well for food security and sovereignty. Another element of this is to decolonize it. And so thinking about that, to support tribal governance and sovereignty at the core of that, decision-making authority with partnerships, the administrative and jurisdiction. So the federal governments have a trust responsibility to tribes and to tribal communities, the fiscal or budgetary appropriations to have that inclusivity for tribal fire stewardship, planning across jurisdictions and how we go about doing the work and the research that we have to inform that, operationally with the implementation and the projects and having the partnerships like with the Nature Conservancy for treks, fire management agreements between the tribes and the national forest. And then at the core of that for me is reconciliation, acknowledging the effects of fire exclusion and suppression and the removal of native burning, the retained rights of native people to be able to utilize fire, which involves the repatriation of returning cultural burning practices to the landscape seeing how that's one of our ways that we can be adaptive and to address climate change and the conditions now, and in a form of restoration and ecocultural revitalization to bring back fire in the right way, in the right place, in the right time for a variety of benefits to tribes and society. So just in that last part, and acknowledging the best available science here, I've gone through that, touched on some of those things, but acknowledging respecting tribal sovereignty, having national and regional initiatives and programs at the government level to do that. The full cycle of research that has tribal participation, oversight, and review, and how the even data is shared and what is publicly disclosed or not. And then the effect management and policy development, both locally and nationally, and how that respectful knowledge sharing amongst Indigenous communities and Western scientists and managers, such as we're having here today. Yothwa, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lake, for that presentation. And I'd like to turn to Merv George Jr. for our second presenter.
Once again, thank you everyone for this opportunity to have a chance to chat with you and tell you a little bit more about my world. You know, currently I'm coming to you live from my garage in Hoopa, California. I am an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley tribe. My father was the Hoopa. My mother is an enrolled member of the Karuk tribe, but I do have tribal ancestry and relatives all throughout the Pacific Northwest. And so it's always really humbling and an honor to be able to work with all of your family and friends up and down the ecosystems and the rivers that we enjoy. You know, I've spent 27 years in a professional capacity now managing natural resources and trying to figure out how we can live in balance with our forests. Before that, I will tell you that my upbringing was full of cultural lessons coming from cultural practitioners that go multi-generations. I have grandmothers who were basket weavers. I come from a long line of hunters and fishermen. And so when you're looking at a modern forest, you know, to me, the whole traditional ecological knowledge is a way of life. It's a value system, and figuring out a way to incorporate that into modern laws and practices has been my life's work. I've been on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest now since May of 2018. Prior to being the forest supervisor there, I was also the forest supervisor on the Six Rivers National Forest, which houses a lot of the ancestral territory of the Hoopa people, as well as the Yurok and Karuk people. I was the forest supervisor from 2014 to 2018. And prior to being the forest soup, I was the deputy forest supervisor on the Six Rivers from 2011 to 14. So for 9 years now, I've had the opportunity of being a forest supervisor within the United States Forest Service. So many of you may be wondering, well, what does that mean and what is that job? When you're the forest supervisor of a national forest, you are legally responsible and have fiduciary responsibility for everything that happens on that national forest. I have a letter of delegation that comes from the chief of the Forest Service that anything that happens on the forest, I'm legally and morally and ethically responsible for it. And so there lies the challenge of what this job is all about. I will tell you that you have to have a very strong political stomach to have a job like this. You have to love people. You have to embrace diversity of thought. You have to be able to deal with some of the most challenging things that are happening in our world right now. In the last 7 years alone, I have hired 80 incident management teams to deal with some of our catastrophic wildfires, which I will coin bad fire, that can happen during the hottest months of the year in some of the areas that we don't want to see fire because they're not ready to see it yet. I've also had the opportunity to put a lot of projects together collaboratively with our communities and tribes to try to put good fire on the landscape. You know, there's a lot of people who do not understand the difference between bad fires and good fires, because I will tell you, not all fire is equal. Like I mentioned, in the last 7 years, I've hired 80 incident management teams. I've spent over $1 billion of taxpayer money, and I've hired over 50,000 firefighters to come help our communities be safe and to be able to protect life and property. I have also been humbled with the responsibility of hiring and working very closely with all of our communities that our country has. And there lies probably one of the most difficult things that I do on a day-to-day basis, is manage public lands with a community who is not all in unison or in consensus of how to manage public lands. And of course, we cannot forget the fact that these lands, before they were public lands, were being stewarded by the original folks that were taking care of them. And that is our indigenous populations that have been here for thousands of years. So where I see myself and my role nowadays is to be a bridge for our communities. It's not to try to reinvent the wheel. It's, in some cases, it's utilizing techniques and practices that have been successful for thousands of years and bringing them into the modern day future that we now live in, and to be able to navigate some of these issues. I will be right up front and tell you that when I joined the Forest Service in 2008, my first job was the Regional Tribal Relations Program Manager out of Vallejo, California for the Pacific Southwest region of the Forest Service. It was my job to help every national forest in Region 5 work with its indigenous communities. It was a very tall order because one of the things that you need to know is that a lot of non-native people do not know the sovereign status or the histories of our tribes. And so one may wonder, how does a guy who has a Native American Studies degree from Humboldt State University, how does he get to be in a job where he's managing a whole national forest? Well, I will tell you that a lot of my job is not about just the science, it's not about just the laws. It really comes down to people. You know, I have the opportunity to work with so many different walks of life, people with so much passion, people who have different backgrounds and different views of how they want their forests to look. And it's my job to somehow make sense of it all and to do projects that keep people safe. It's to do projects that are going to protect our watersheds and our fisheries and our sacred sites. It's going to be to produce projects that are going to produce jobs and to be able to keep an economy going in a time where it's really challenging. Keeping people safe. It's one of the most humbling things that I do. And I will tell you, it's not an easy job. But I feel blessed every single day. I do not feel like I'm alone when I'm doing these jobs. I feel like I've got strong family and friends and ancestors who watch over me every single day. I find myself always being amazed with the commitment of public service and being able to work side by side with some of the most hardworking public servants that we have in our world. And it's that energy that probably keeps me going. There's so many different things that I could share and talk about, but I'm going to stand by for our discussion phase to be able to dive deeper into any of these specific areas. So once again, thank you for this opportunity to be here.
Chikanik, thank you so much, Merv. Those are very powerful words, and it's always very refreshing to hear encouraging words too. And one of our next panelists we have coming up now is going to be Dr. Jared Aldrin, and I will let him take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I'll share my screen here. Share that. All right, thank you. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here and talk with you all today and listen to the other presenters and participants. So by way of further introduction on my next slide, don't be intimidated by all the, or don't be worried by all the text I have on here. I'm not going to run through my whole resume, but just to tell you a little bit more about where I'm coming from as a settler scholar and a fire practitioner who collaborates with Indigenous people. My name is Jared Aldrin, and my middle name and last name are Norwegian. Dal is the Norwegian name for valley, and Aldrin is the name of the island that my grandfather immigrated from when he came to the US. So I'm Norwegian German. I was born and raised in South Dakota on Dakota, Lakota, and Omaha lands. and raised there. I went to college in New York State and got a degree in physics, of all things, way back in 1981. And after my bachelor's degree, I moved to California. I lived in San Diego County for 24 years, where the lands of Cahuilla, Cupeño, Ipai, Tipai, Payom, Coachum people come together, where they intersect and interrelate with one another. Eventually, I picked up a master's in 2002 and then a PhD finally in 2010, both at Prescott College, which is on the homeland of Yavapai people. And both of those theses, the master's thesis and the doctorate, mostly looked at indigenous stories, so collaborations with Ipai people and North Fork Mono people and other people to look at their stories as historical documents and sustainability lessons, really, and to look at fire history through creation stories and other stories of the tribes. So I currently live in Clovis, California. That's where I'm speaking. I'm speaking to you from my basement in Clovis, California right now. That's on Gashawu Yokuts land, and the closest rancheria is Table Mountain Rancheria to where I live. I do collaborate with Mono and Yokuts people in the nearby Sierra foothills and higher elevations of the Sierra Nevada. I spent a whole career in between, or before, during, and after this graduate work in kindergarten through 12th grade teaching and curriculum development and teachers' workshops. And I worked with Native educators up and down the state of California and some from outside of California as I did that work. I also spent some time as temporary faculty in American Indian Studies at Palomar College and San Diego State University, and in Native American Studies at Stanford University. And I was involved in a research group there called the Indigenous Fire Ecology Collaborative, and that's where I had a chance to meet and talk and work a little bit with Frank Lake. So it's good to see Frank and everyone here today. And I also served on the graduate faculty back at Prescott, where I got my graduate degrees. Also various projects and contracts with tribes and school districts, again, up and down the state of California. And I've been fortunate to co-author some articles on cultural fire and fire history with members of the North Fork Mono tribe and members of the coastal band of the Chumash Nation. I have been involved in cultural burns with the North Fork Mono tribe and Cold Springs Rancheria, where I was, that was my last place of employment before I retired. I was a tribal administrator for a while, and before that, the EPA manager for Cold Springs. I've also burned with private property owners, including the big utility company, Southern California Edison, and I've been able to watch and observe how CAL FIRE and Forest Service conduct burns, and I've observed fire trainings, although not participated in them, with the Yurok and Karuk Trexes. And just recently, this year, I was one of the co-founders of what we're calling the Sierra Sequoia Burn Co-op, which is a coalition of 4 tribes and private landowners here in Fresno County and beyond. We're working with folks in Madera and Tulare counties also. And last on my detailed resume slide here is also a new project. I'm a research associate and lead investigator for what's called the West on Fire project, which is a multidisciplinary look at fire history and fire in our contemporary landscape. It's based in Los Angeles at the Huntington USC Institute on California in the West. And I have a little reminder for myself down here at the bottom on reciprocal relations, because as I just told you my life story here, throughout my life and career, what I've tried to do and tried to get better at as a settler is, not to come in and displace or replace Native people, but to reach an agreement, for instance, with a research or educational collaboration and make sure that the indigenous people or the tribes that I'm working with are getting equal benefit out of that, as you know, as I've derived great benefit from my working relationships with folks. Here's a map of the area just outside of Clovis where I live, up on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. And it's a map of historic, the title is A Map of Indian Trails on the Sierra National Forest. It's by a historian by the name of Jim Snyder, who was, he's retired now, but he was a historian with Yosemite National Park. And, but his study was on the National Forest. This is, if you can see my arrow on the screen, this is Yosemite National Park, this brown area up here. And down in the corner here is Kings Canyon and Sequoia. And this whole green area in the middle is Sierra National Forest. So he did exhaustive research, and this is his hand-drawn map, just on I took a photo of it. It's a fold-out map of the Sierra National Forest. And, you know, part of the interest of it for me is where trails come together, like here at Shaver Lake. And those wide areas, by the way, are mostly private land owned by Southern California Edison, but the green areas all around are national forest. This area around Mammoth Pool, which burned very severely recently in the Creek Fire. And up here around Mono Springs, where my arrow is now, if you can see that. So there was, these were not just routes from place A to place B, but since time immemorial, they're places themselves. The trails are long, winding, rolling places where people had just active interchange, you know, going over the Sierra Crest to visit Paiute relatives and trading partners. And this trail down here would have continued down the, sorry about that, would have continued down the San Joaquin River to take people over to visit relatives and trade on the coast also. So one of the things that you know, has been going on in the forest and along these trails, as I say, since time immemorial, is burning and burning to culture food sources, part of the food sovereignty of indigenous people. And this is just a quick photo of a cultural burn that I was involved in at Cold Springs Rancheria. And it's about as small a scale of a burn as you might be able to imagine. It's two shrubs, two sourberry shrubs. So the sourberry plant is cultured both for basket materials and for the berries themselves. They're delicious, especially with a little salt or salt grass on them. So you can imagine maybe, we didn't do it this time, but you can imagine maybe running the fire up the slope and under those blue oak trees and making it a larger scale burn. But also imagine this scale of burn or slightly larger along those trails and that vast kind of interlaced, interconnected network of trails. And one of the things that Jim Snyder looked at when he put the evidence for where those trails were was he said, you know, there are a lot of resources in the foothills. So on this map, this is from CalFlora, state plant database. And on this map, down here in the foothill areas around Prather and Toll House, and this area down in the lower left corner is the getting into the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley. But these are all spots where botanists have collected samples of sourberry, and it's certainly not all the sourberry in the region. It's just, you know, where botanists have collected samples and uploaded them into the CalFlora database. But Jim Snyder said one of the indications of trails is when foothill resources like sourberry is taken into the upper elevations. So it's interesting to me that up here at 7,000 feet, where my arrow is now, near Huntington Lake, which again burned pretty severely, this area in the cedar fire. So it'll be interesting to see how everything comes out in the aftermath. But there's sourberry growing up there, and it's right along one of those trails that shows in Snyder's map. So people were carrying resources, including food resources, up into the upper elevations and culturing them and caring for them, stewarding them where they, quote, naturally, unquote, wouldn't grow. So here's a map, an earlier map that was constructed by an ethnographer, Theodoratus Cultural Research Incorporated, and it gets into more detail. So Snyder's map had those kind of broad travel corridors. And here, Dorothea Theodoratus and her colleagues interviewed elders at Cold Springs in the late 70s and early 80s. And they made a map of trails in more detail, particularly in this Dinky Creek area. And the trails follow drainages like Providence Creek here and Duff Creek. Next slide. Let's show the next slide. And these are those trails going up the drainages. And this was a map based on Theodoratus's map that Cold Springs Rancheria produced while I was employed there. And you can start to see, again, how even in finer detail, you know, people weren't just traveling from place to place, they were living along and living on these trails. It's really like a web up and down the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. So problems and challenges, you know, it would be in terms of bringing indigenous fire back to scale along trails, along region-wide trails, really like that today. Here's a recent photo of the Sierra National Forest, and it is temporarily closed. In fact, every national forest in the region was closed at some point this fall. But the Sierra National Forest closed down its forest to all entrance, to all visitors in the aftermath of the Creek Fire, even outside of the Creek Fire zone. So, you know, it happened this fall just when, for instance, it was time for people to want to go gather acorns in their traditional areas. You know, there are people who can't even get to areas to gather firewood for the winter at this point. And access is a real issue, I would say, in terms of, you know, reaching agreements with the forest and trying to get back into areas that traditionally people did have access to. This is a 1916 map of the area down Cold Springs Rancheria would be down in this area here where it says Sycamore Station, Sycamore Ranger Station. And here's Shaver Lake again. It's gotten bigger since 1916 and changed shape a little bit, but that's Shaver Lake. And these are those areas on the previous map where I was, you know, tracing out those traditional trails, and you can see a trail here. So in 1916, the forest was right up against the rancheria, and people had immediate access to their traditional gathering grounds. But, you know, at this point, a lot of this is now private property. If I showed you, this would be showing up in white on a forest map of Sycamore Creek here. And lots of locked gates. The last time I went up the road there, the last gate that was locked, there was a sign that said, no trespassing, trespassers will be shot, and survivors will be shot again. So for 150 years, there's been a real threat to safety for indigenous people who want and need access to get up into the forest to steward their resources. So just a couple shots from the Sierra Sequoia Burn Cooperative that I'm involved with. This is a pile burn that we had with 2 tribes participating on a ranch, a private ranch. A couple of members of Cold Springs there monitoring the pile burn. And this is the rancher here. So when I talk about reciprocal relations, you know, the Cold Springs and Dunlap tribal members showed up to help with the burn prep in and the burn. And this rancher, in exchange, gave everyone a little bit of training on his skid steer, on his heavy equipment, as a way to construct the pile. So there was, you know, reciprocal exchange involved in that relationship, and that's what we're trying to base the co-op on as we move forward. So here's my little suggested, as a settler's guide to restoring indigenous fire and foods. Just advice to other settlers, I guess, who are interested in supporting indigenous cultural fire and indigenous food sovereignty. You know, first and foremost, I would say attend tribal events that are open to the public and start to build relationships with the tribes in your area. It's a little difficult right now with COVID, but you can certainly follow folks on Facebook and attend events like this one online and start to build those relationships. If you're a landowner, you know, through those relationships that you build, start to invite native people to your land. Both a big landowner like Southern California Edison and smaller landowners, I'm thinking of a property in Mariposa, have history. Private owners, some private owners have a history of inviting people to gather and to burn with the property owner on their land. And also just, you know, if you're not a tribal member, you can still work to restore the standing, to restore the jurisdiction of tribes. And that word, jurisdiction, juris is law and diction means to speak. So to exert jurisdiction is to speak the law over the land. And tribes have been speaking the law through their stories of how to manage or how to relate to their land for thousands and thousands upon of years. And you know, it's time to do what you can to support and restore their rightful jurisdiction. One example I have here is just a possibility for the Forest Service in our area. I know Frank and Merv have developed lots of great and more fully developed partnerships with tribes in the Northwest area of California and Southern Oregon. Here in the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, with the Sierra National Forest, for instance, one possibility has come up for a Bureau of Indian Affairs collaboration with the Forest Service, where it would be a joint funded position, like maybe the tribal liaison for the forest. But even thinking ahead in years ahead, a line officer like a district ranger could be funded by both the BIA and the U.S. Forest Service. And that person then would be answerable possibly through 638 self-determination contracts or some other mechanism, would be answerable not only to the Forest Service, but to local tribal councils. For something like this to work, you know, both agencies really need to get full funding. So politically, we can press our congressional members to fully fund the Forest Service and the BIA and tribes. And just one final closing thought here. You know, one of the challenges of climate change is that plants and animals will be moving to adapt to warming temperatures. Many plants and animals will be migrating north or migrating up in elevation. And we've already seen that tribes are experts at facilitating the movement of species up in elevation. And as far as north to south movement of plant and animal relatives, I would say that, you know, we as settlers just need to make sure that that tribes have a way of interacting, collaborating with their relatives north to south, and you know, so that tribes in Madera County are talking with tribes in Tulare County and to the south about how they're working with fire, how they're stewarding their foods, and just support that whole network that historically was on those trails and could be again, and could be through other modes of communication. Make sure that people are interacting and learning with each other and talking together. So that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Aldrin, for your excellent presentation. And we'd like to go ahead and invite Ronnie Reed to open up our last presentation.
And before Ronnie gets started, I'd just like to remind everyone to use the Q&A feature for any questions you have at the bottom of your screen. We will be answering those at the panel at the end. Are you there, Ronnie?
Yeah, I am. Sorry about that. Oh,
Yeah,
pause.
no worries. I'll let you take it away.
Before I get started, I just want to give a little acknowledgement to the HSU Food Sovereignty Lab. I really think this is a really good opportunity for myself as well as you guys. And I really greatly appreciate to be a part of this meeting as well as just being in this situation. It's very humbling. My name is Ronnie Reed. I'm a proud Native American of the Kaduk, Yurok, and Hoopa tribes. I am an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley tribe with the descendancy of the Kaduk tribe from my father, Ron Reed Sr., and the descendancy of the Yurok and the Hoopa from my mother, Robin Reed. Also, before she got married, Robin Davis. She is also a member of the Hoopa Valley tribe. For the first 3 years of my life, I lived on the Hoopa Valley Reservation with both my parents, and then moved up to Bar, California, which is also known as Cudamine, the Kaduk people. Cudamine is the center of the world for the Kaduk people, which resides on the Mid-Klamath watershed basin. Very important area, and I'm very grateful to live there my entire life. Throughout my years, I grew up in a very prestigious home of my dad, going to numerous meetings and fighting for what's right for us as Kaduk people and Indigenous people, for the Hoopa, the Yuroks, and everyone around the surrounding areas of the Klamath River. Once I graduated from high school of Happy Camp High back in 2011, I decided to go on further my education at Shasta Community College, where I got my associate's science degree in natural resources. For a while before graduating, it took me a little while to what I really wanted to do. In high school, I had the opportunity and privilege to work under Frank Lake, which is pretty awesome because now here I am in the same room as him. Not for the first time, but hopefully not the last time either. He was my mentor in high school my senior year. I did my senior project was on traditional ecological knowledge, also known as TEK. Once I graduated from Happy Camp High, I thought I'd wanted to get into the CAL FIRE side of things. And once I got in the CAL FIRE side of things, the city thing, I realized that wasn't really the route I wanted to take. So I decided to start kind of branching out and getting enrolled in different classes that was issued at Shasta College. So I got in a couple natural resource classes and realized this is really exactly where I wanted to go. The route I wanted to continue on, and it felt like it was a good opportunity for myself. Once I graduated from Shasta College in 2015, I then returned home to Orleans, California, Bar, California area, Cudamine, and decided that I wanted to further my education as a student on the land, not necessarily in the room, not in the classroom, but like on the landscape. So I decided to work for Mid-Klamath Watershed Council. I had an opportunity to work in numerous positions while I was there. I started out working in the fisheries department, kind of getting my feet wet again because that's what I was comfortable with coming in. During high school, I was always an intern with the fisheries of the Kaduk tribe department, natural resources. And then I kind of was thinking, okay, well, I kind of need to, branch out a little bit more and kind of get in some areas that I'm not comfortable with. And luckily there's a fires and fuels program that Mid-Klamath Watershed Council is a part of as well. there's a lot of great opportunities in that organization that I'm really grateful to be a part of. I started getting my feet wet in the fires and fields of, piling brush, burning piles, fuels reduction, getting really engaged with the landowners of the local area. Once I started getting in that, I really was getting engaged with being a part, like gaining relationships with people from the area, outside of the area. And I was getting really engaged with that. And then the position came up within Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, and I became a part of the WKRP, which is the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, where I was a crew lead supervisor, and we did a lot of numerous different jobs. Most of them going from timber marking, from laying out burn units, to walking numerous mountainous terrains of the Six Rivers National Forest, as well as the Klamath National Forest. A lot of good work that was held in that opportunity that I had, and as well as like just kind of engaging with the opportunities with the locals, as well as the mentors that I've had my entire life. And I thought it was a really good opportunity for myself. So I took advantage of it and really got engaged and also, what's the word? Sorry. Got really engaged with that. And once the seasons went on with being a part of the WKRP, I had the opportunity to be part of the Klamath Treks, same area, Orleans, California, part of Mid-Klamath Watershed Council. And I got my basic 40, like all my fire basic classes, and I really wanted to get in the fire realm. So I was a part of the Klamath Treks back in 2017 and did 2 weeks of learning and engaging with landowners, local entities, other collaborations, local tribes. And I learned a lot. I got to learn a lot. And that's really, really what put me to the position I'm in today. I really got engaged with burning, just holding those different types of tools to burn really influenced me and where I'm at. So the following year, in 2018, I decided to apply for the U.S. Forest Service. At the time, I really didn't want to, but I chose to, because if I really want to get more experience and do a lot more learning, I felt like this was a great opportunity for myself. At the time, there was a new up and coming crew, the Wildland Fire Use Module out of Orleans. They're a local small 10-man crew that emphasis and focus a lot on burning, and a lot of prescribed burning, a lot of wilderness burning, a lot of natural burning, not necessarily too much on the suppressional side of things at the time. And I really thought that was a really good opportunity. Again, took advantage of that opportunity, applied, and received the job offer a couple months later. Had a really good time, spent a lot of time in the Sierras, a lot of time on the Six Rivers, a lot of time all over the place my first year as a wildland firefighter. Had a really good time. I moved on. Next year, I applied for a permanent position just because I felt this is exactly what I wanted to do, to keep going, keep getting this position, and continue to pave the way for myself and the future of our people, the future of our children, the future of our rivers, the forests, everything. And I felt like it was a great opportunity. I applied. A few months later, I received a notice that I got denied for the position. And then a couple weeks later, I get another call saying that someone backed out of the position, and if I want it, I can have this position. So up to this point, like, I just feel like I'm really, as I talk now, like I'm just so lucky to be in the position I am now, to be a part of this and be so grateful for this opportunity. So I ended up moving down the road a little bit back to the homelands of my mom in Hoopa, California, on the Hoopa Reservation. Stayed with my cousin the last couple of years to work out of Willow Creek, California, to shorten my commute a little bit, where I started to get more engaged with more of a supervisory leadership role as I go on with my wildland career. So as years go on, I've done numerous things in the wildland field, as well as like being an apprentice. A lot of opportunities there too. Like you choose to be on a engine, or choose to be on a hand crew, choose to be on a helicopter, and all those different opportunities that just to get your qualifications up and get engaged and take advantage of the opportunities. For me, like what I understand is like take advantage of the opportunities while I got them, while I'm young, and also not that, but like also like just to help myself, to help give back to the land, to help keep providing. Like in order for me to do that, I feel like I gotta have these qualifications. I gotta keep these opportunities rolling. So here I am now. I just recently got laid off for the fire season, as in others nowadays say the fire year, because shoot, we're in end of November and there's still opportunities for fire. But this is also the best time of year to burn for our foods, burn for the animals, burn for ourselves, you know. And a lot of times during these crazy times, it's really hard to get engaged with burning after large fires that we've had the last couple of months. It's really hard to get those opportunities to put good fire on the ground, and also have those relationships of the differences between good fire and bad fire. So the last couple weeks before getting laid off, I spent a lot of my time burning up in Willow Creek on the waterman units, doing numerous pile burns, and kind of just getting re-engaged, because it's been a long season, but at the end of the day, this is why I'm here. This is why I chose this field work, because you know, I want to do more engagement with burning and gain relationships with colleagues like Frank Lake, who's not just a colleague, he's like a really good mentor, a family friend, just like Merv George. I'm very honored to be in this room with everybody, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. And yeah, just gaining relationships is important for me, as well as like to the land, because the more knowledge I'm able to receive from all these folks that I'm in the same Zoom meeting with is going to only help me, and not only help me, but the future of our children and the future of our people that reside on these lands. And so yeah, that's basically the spiel I have for now, and I'm willing to let you guys talk a little more, and I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Really awesome to see Indigenous people starting to make their way into the workforce like that. And I would like to ask all our panelists to come back on, as we're going to get started with our Q&A. It's really quite amazing talk we had today, so relevant too with you know, the wildfires we've been experiencing here in California and the West Coast on recent years. And it looks like we've got like definitely a few questions in the Q&A panel here. And to get started, let's see. All right. I just had an over question I kind of took, wanted to ask you all too. Anyone can jump in if they feel they have an answer. But I did just want to ask if any of you had observed any changes in policies or perception of forest management, particularly regarding traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous-led stewardship on a federal or a state level.
Well, I certainly can take a crack at it. So I've certainly seen a shift in federal policies within the last decade, for sure, of the willingness of agencies like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management to work side by side with tribal communities. I know back in the 90s when I was the tribal chairman for the Hoopa tribe, I was always begging and pleading my case to work with the Six Rivers National Forest for co-management opportunities. And we'd always meet with the chief of the Forest Service. We'd be meeting with legislators. And at the time, the Forest Service, I don't think, felt like they needed any partners. I don't think they were really open to the idea of working with Indigenous communities, because there certainly was some differences in opinions about what the forests were for and what their values were. And so over time, I can tell you now that with a lot of the workforce continually shrinking in agencies like the Forest Service, we find ourselves now pronouncing words like good neighbor authority and doing things that are cooperative in spirit. We have a lot of opportunities now, I believe, because not only a shift in policies and laws, we have things like the Farm Bill that came out in 2008 that are built and put together to build relationships instead of tearing them apart. We have things like the Tribal Forest Protection Act, which came out under the Healthy Forest Initiative. Now, it was mentioned earlier, we have 93-638 opportunities with the Department of Agriculture, whereas before that was strictly for Department of Interior agencies. You have all of these opportunities now if you have the relationships in place. And let's not confuse this issue. Just because you have laws in place does not make the relationship automatically happen. And so in order to implement these things, you have to get past the awkward first date stage, and you've got to form some meaningful relationships with those that are going to be implementing them. And I believe that is the hardest part. It's not getting the laws or the interests in place. It's establishing the relationships in place to get there, which I believe is the hardest part. So definitely I've seen a shift in the last decade.
Yeah, one of the ones I want to reiterate, if people don't know, is the state gathering policy. The California Union Basket Weavers have really headed this up initially, probably about 10, 12 years ago, maybe longer now. But that has non-permitted, or you don't need permits to be able to gather traditional foods and materials off of Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service lands. It's different for the Park Service, but the California State Gathering Policy, those of you that don't know about it, you can print out like a little 8.5 by 11 thing that says traditional gathering, put it on your dash, law enforcement shouldn't harass you, and that's basically your way to say I retain rights to gather. The other one that Murph talked about under the Farm Bill is Chapter 230, Chapter 32A, Heritage Cooperation Authority Act, that has requests for forest products for traditional and cultural purposes, often related to larger things like wood for canoes and house and traditional structures. But there's also the seasonal closures that they use for ceremonies, but they also can very well, after having an area cooperatively managed, do a seasonal closure that's for traditional gathering. And with the forest plan revision and the science synthesis that I've been a contributor to, as the Northwest Forest Plan is revised and that then have the national forest that tier their land resource management plans, having areas designated within that as tribal stewardship areas. The national forests currently have the cultural management areas like the Cutamene District, Cutamene, Howcow District for the high country. You could also have areas in there that are tribal stewardship areas that have that have areas closed for traditional gathering that would alleviate any economic or other public uses over the competition and gathering those. So there's other ways to expand existing authority. And then I'd say the more recent ones that we would need to have perhaps would be looking at under the National Environmental Policy Act for projects where tribal gathering, particularly honoring food sovereignty, is evaluated as one of the impacts of consideration for alternatives. When you have environmental planners and line officers saying, yes, we're going to look at a 10-year life cycle of this project, and part of that permitted activity that's been analyzed by the botanist, the wildlife, the fisheries, all the specialists, heritage and culture, it could facilitate tribal gathering that goes along with those existing policies. Thank you.
Unless anyone else has some words to follow up, thank you, Merv and Dr. Lake. We do have some wonderful comments of appreciation and more questions, so we'll go ahead and open another one. And we did put a link in the chat in reference to what Dr. Frank Lake was talking about, to know your rights for harvesting. Thanks for that reference. We have a speaker, an attendee, Martha Nungisser. I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. They state they're particularly interested in how the tribal knowledge is addressing changing effects of climate change on the native ecosystems. What adaptations, if any yet, are being considered? And if there's any details you can share. Thank you.
Actually, my work around ethnobotany and tribal forest management and fire really kind of worked its way into the effects of climate change on traditional uses of habitats and resources. So I would really guide you towards the Karuk adaptation plan. There are other websites there. I've been a contributor to that work with Dr. Carrie Nargard and the Karuk tribe. I currently have the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center funded projects with the Yurok tribe, and also working with my colleague Jonathan Long, who Jared's worked with Ron Good on the Black Oaks. Jonathan and I have also written quite a bit on the Northwest Forest Plan science synthesis. But in that regard, there's a lot of opportunity there to see how we are framing different than the Western academic or organizational approach, the effects of climate change to tribes. And then you're gonna have Kyle next week. I'm also working with him on the National Climate Assessment, the Indigenous Peoples chapter there. And so at all scales, I'm greatly involved with that work, and we appreciate, helping to share whatever I could on that, more than I can get into. But yeah, definitely the way of framing it and then going about doing that work, and then really being a support service as part of my trust responsibility to tribes in the formation of those climate vulnerability adaptation plans.
Would anyone else like to follow up?
I'll just mention quickly that I'm looking forward to next week's speaker also, because I think your theme is going to be on climate change and food sovereignty. So probably touching on much of what Frank just talked about, but there's a lot to discuss and chew on with that topic.
Yeah, and if you look at my U.S. Forest Service tree search, you'll see my publications there. Some of the ones on tribal climate change impacts of traditional foods with Bosker and Kathy Lynn, and then another one on forest. So I have written and co-authored quite a bit on this. Also, actually today we have a science article released on fire and biodiversity and Anthropocene that's addressing the factors of this, particularly indigenous fire stewardship, and addressing and mitigating the effects of climate amplification and climate change on fire.
Thank you so much. We have another question here coming from Barbara Wall. It was addressed to Dr. Lake, but I imagine anyone can answer it. But Barbara Wall is interested in hearing more about the challenges of collaborations between knowledge holders and government agencies, and was also wondering if anyone could speak more about gender roles associated with fires.
I'll let Murph take that one from the policy and leadership, and then I'll chime in from the ground with the science. And if Ronnie wants to talk about it, or Jared, they can too.
So maybe we can restate that first part of that question again.
Of course. So Barbara was wondering, she was interested in hearing more about the challenges of collaborations between knowledge holders and government agencies.
So the first thing you got to do is you got to figure out, when you get people into the room that are going to work with each other, it's really important for the federal agency folks that come into these assignments that they understand the history and the past of that area. You don't get the luxury of a fresh scorecard just because you got a new job as a district ranger or as a forest supervisor. You truly have to have an appreciation for the history, the good, the bad, the ugly, in order to navigate the future together. I think a lot of people make the mistake of not understanding some of the history. Like, one only needs to look, here on the Six Rivers National Forest, for example, the tribal relations issues that have taken place over the years, are too many to list. There's been so many challenges that it always perplexes brand new employees that come into the area from all over the country. And they're like, why is there so much energy with these tribes? Because they think they can come in and just start fresh. Well, to the tribal people, these green uniforms and the green trucks that used to drive up and down the road sometimes were a symbol of the enemy. I know growing up here in Hoopa, the Forest Service folks would drive through the valley as fast as they could to be able to go up to the forest. They wouldn't look at anybody. They wouldn't wave at anybody. They had this like military presence that made you feel unwelcome. And, I never knew anybody that worked for the Forest Service. And in fact, it wasn't until I got to be working at the Hoopa Valley Tribe that I started working one-on-one with the Forest Service. And it was like, oh, well, not everyone in the Forest Service is racist. They just don't have a clue about what tribes are. And so some of those challenges are understanding the history. Some of those challenges are not, having an established rapport between agency folks or tribal folks. And, that is the hardest part, to be honest with you. In the 27 years that I've been doing this, getting these relationships established, whether it be at the worker bee level, whether it be at the policy and the leadership level, getting those relationships established is the hardest part. Because until you get people that are willing to work together and willing to take the time to learn, you're going to spin your wheels and you're just going to struggle. And, more than likely there's going to be just hardships on both sides. And so you can't get to a collaborative effort or someplace good until you get past that awkward first date stage, and then you actually earn that trust. So that's what I see anyway.
So if I can chime in just for a second, and I'm sorry if you hear my dogs barking in the background. Part of the challenge there, and I don't know what the answer is, but as both as a tribal employee and working, partnering with the Forest Service in my area in various ways, part of the challenge is the Forest Service has a big staff turnover. So you do that work, you build a relationship with a district ranger, for instance, or deputy district ranger, and then they move on to a position in another forest, and you're starting all over again, or fuel management officers, line officers of various sorts, archaeologists, so it's a challenge because you have new people coming in all the time who don't know that history that Merv was just talking about.
Dr. Lake, do you want to add something?
If Ronnie doesn't, I'll recap. One of the most important things is to acknowledge tribal sovereignty of knowledge that would be related to what you're having. I think sometimes being academically trained, we think it's professor office hours. You go in there, you ask questions, you get the answer, but taking responsibility for that knowledge, and also being careful, I guess, even as anybody, when you ask, you're responsible. Then what are you going to do to help perpetuate that knowledge? And so having informed consent is a big part of that. I've also been part of the working group on Indigenous knowledge and climate change initiatives with others. So there's a good partner about informed consent as part of that. And UNDRIP, the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Declaration, is part of that. I think also working through and realizing that for many people, it's the privacy. And sometimes even when you're consulting as a line officer, you might have two different tribes in a room that want to have the confidentiality and a prohibition on disclosure. And so you have to recognize that part of it. So some of the challenges is learning the culturally appropriate frameworks of working with Indigenous knowledge. And then for me, other aspects are, oh, I want to set up a research plot in here. Well, that happens to be my family's gathering area, somebody will say. We don't want researchers with all your flagging and all this stuff going in there and you taking other people there. So I've also had to be very careful when I've been entrusted of knowledge of gathering areas of not sharing that, or if I do it with consent of the elder or the family, show somebody else. Or the graduate student that I share as a research plot has to be careful when they take somebody else's family from a different part or another tribe there because it's national forest. So those are some of the navigating the discretion of how you disclose or not, and what respectful engagement you have with the knowledge that you've been entrusted with.
And I'll talk a little bit more about the question about the gender roles. Honestly, I think it's really affected in different ways. I feel like as a local Native American from where I work now on the 6 Rivers National Forest, surrounded by numerous tribes out here on the coast, back home on the Trinity and Klamath Rivers, I feel like it's important for more female wildland fires to get involved, because from when I grew up, when I learned the female life, that was the most important role in Native families, some super powerful role. And it kind of, from what I understand, it's like the same thing for wildland fire. I really would love to see more, not only women in the fire realm, but also Native women, locals, get engaged, continue the fight. And I really hope to see more Native women in the fire field as well. And if there's anyone listening right now that are really interested in it, that are male or female, feel free to reach out to me. Sometimes the application process can be intimidating, but the last couple of years it's been super easy. But yeah, I really think it's important for more of the females side of things to actually get more involved, get engaged. Things are changing, and they will continue to change for as long as we want. And I really think that the more women we get involved with this, this nice little run, and to continue the race of getting the good fire back on the ground for not only our future, the children, but the animals, the fish, the rivers, the creeks. I think it's really important. And I think if we all come on board as people from all over, all different genders, races, I think that's when it really get things going.
Thank you, Ronnie, for your comments and insights from everyone speaking today. We are getting closer to our closing time, so I'd like to save the last couple of minutes to hear from any of our panelists about any points they'd like to reiterate or touch upon. We had a broad spectrum of topics today: traditional use of fire management, why this fostered biodiversity, why this is connected to food production, and so much more. So the reintroduction of fire practice was also talked about, the challenges, the successes, and the thoughts for the future. So I'd like to go ahead and pass the mic to any of you.
Oh, heck, I'm not shy. I'll say it. Keep it living. Part of my, I guess, the work I bring in my science is being a cultural practitioner and trying to gather every week, every time, every season, always be on there. And, we all have our own cultural protocols for introducing ourselves, asking to receive knowledge from nature. Let nature be your teacher. And, you got to be out there. You got to get out of the office, got to get out of the house. You got to get off the computer, put down the device, and go out there and ask to be shown, collect and be thankful. Hang out with chipmunk, grouse, bear, deer, whatever by the river, and keep that knowledge living through your direct observations and learn something and teach somebody else. That's what I got to say.
When I think about climate change, from a wildland fire perspective and as an agency administrator, our fire seasons are getting a lot longer, and we're starting to see a lot of rare weather events that are adding to the severity of our fires. The Slater fire that started in Happy Camp, California this year that blew onto the Rogue River Siskiyou, that fire got to 100,000 acres, what we term as a mega fire, in less than 24 hours. And when you look at the burn severity of the vegetation, the majority of that 100,000 acres is high severity. So we nuclear burned all these acorn trees. We destroyed a lot of these watersheds, all of these furry critters and feathered friends that we spend a lot of time trying to protect. They're gone now. And so when I look at the high severity fires that we do see when we have these trifecta of weather, which is east winds combined with single digit relative humidity and 100-degree weather. If you see those three things coming together, if there's an ignition source anywhere nearby, you're going to see a lot of devastation. And to the tribal, the sovereignty with the foods, when our forests are not healthy, we are not healthy, nor is our food sources, including our water supplies. So one of the things that I am really trying to do is to educate people the difference between good fire and bad fire, the need to why we need more good fires on the landscape, and trying to figure out how we can move together and preserve a lot of the culture and a lot of the way of life that we have seen as Indigenous people into this future as we're navigating all of these safety concerns. It's extremely complicated. It is not simple. There's going to be a lot of need for communications and transparency, but more than that, there's going to be a need for a lot of love and people to have hard conversations and willing to have them. So it's been a pleasure to meet all of you. I look forward to working with you in the future. And so if you're ever up on the Rogue River Siskiyou or hanging out in Hoopa, let me know. Look forward to seeing you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Merv. That was such a great ending to this panel. It really is about love. And for that, I'd like to extend out one last chance for anyone else on the panel to say anything else. But thank you, everyone, for joining today. It is just about to tick over to 2:30, so we do want to be mindful of your time. But thank you again to all our panelists today. And thank you again to my co-host here, Evie. And I hope you all have a great day. Chikanik.
If you're still with us, I just want to share briefly. Next panel discussion will be Indigenous food sovereignty and timing of climate change with Dr. Kyle White. We'll be live next Monday, November 30th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. If you want to catch up with our Native American Heritage Month Food Sovereignty Speaker Series, view the first session and learn about our emerging HSU Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace History and Vision. Visit the HSU Native American Studies Facebook page. Also, you can view any of the recorded sessions at the HSU NAS YouTube channel. We have much gratitude for everyone that came today as an attendee as well as a speaker, and we look forward to seeing you next Monday.
Thank you again for inviting me, and I appreciate the other panelists. It's always been good to see you guys. Been good. Thank you. Appreciate it. And all that Humboldt State and doing the Food Sovereignty Lab, and look forward to contributing there to y'all.
Thanks so much, everyone.
And a friendly reminder, Kyle's talk is from 2:30 to 4 next week.
Yeah, I just want to say again, thank you very much for this opportunity. As I've been working in this area, I just recently learned, start getting comfortable as you develop these roles as leader. Get comfortable being in a room that have a lot of people that are smarter than you. And today is one of those prime examples. Got a couple doctors, Merv George that I've known a long time since I was a little kid. This is really humbling for me, and I really looking forward to working with all of you in the future. And I hope you guys have really good time with your families in these tough times, and I'll see you guys soon.